Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. The Bride in the Village Shop. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead's main street as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Fletcher's village shop, her wicker basket swinging gently at her side. The October air held that particular crispness that promised winter's approach, and she pulled her woolen cardigan a bit closer as she contemplated her modest shopping list. Tea, perhaps some digestive biscuits, and if Mr. Fletcher had managed to procure some decent butter despite the ongoing rationing difficulties. What she did not expect to encounter, however, was a vision in yellowed satin and antique lace standing before the tinned goods section. Miss Marple paused in the doorway, her pale blue eyes widening slightly behind her wire-rimmed spectacles. The woman before her appeared to be somewhere in her middle years, perhaps 45 or 50, though it was difficult to determine with any precision given that her face was partially obscured by a wedding veil of considerable vintage. The dress itself was unmistakably from the 1970s, with its characteristic high neckline, long sleeves, and a train that pooled rather dramatically around the woman's feet as she reached for a tin of sardines. The entire ensemble had clearly seen better days. The once pristine white satin had mellowed to a shade that reminded Miss Marple of old parchment, and there were subtle signs of wear about the hem and sleeves. Yet despite its age, the dress had been carefully maintained. Someone had taken considerable trouble to preserve it, pressing the fabric and mending small tears with nearly invisible stitches. "Good morning, Miss Marple," came the cheerful voice of Mr. Fletcher from behind the counter. "Lovely morning, isn't it? Though I see you've noticed our new resident, Mrs. Fairfax." The woman in the wedding dress turned at the mention of her name, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of dark eyes through the veil's delicate mesh. There was something unsettling about those eyes, a sharpness that seemed at odds with the romantic notion of eternal bridal devotion. "Mrs. Fairfax," Miss Marple said with her characteristic gentle smile, "how lovely to meet you. I'm Jane Marple. I do hope you're settling in well to our little village." "Oh yes, quite well, thank you," came the response, muffled slightly by the veil. The voice held traces of refinement, the sort of accent that suggested good breeding and proper education. "Everyone has been most welcoming." Miss Marple noticed how the woman's hands moved as she spoke, gesturing in a way that seemed almost theatrical. The wedding ring on her finger caught the morning light streaming through the shop window, a simple gold band that showed signs of frequent wear. "I understand you've taken Ivy Cottage," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. "Such a charming little place. I knew Millicent Fairfax quite well, though I must confess she kept rather to herself in recent years." Something flickered across the woman's face at the mention of the cottage's previous owner, a brief tightening around her eyes that Miss Marple filed away for future consideration. "Yes, my great-aunt," Mrs. Fairfax replied. "She left me the cottage. I'm afraid we weren't terribly close, but family is family, isn't it?" Mr. Fletcher, who had been arranging tins with unnecessary vigour during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Fairfax has been shopping here for about 3 months now, haven't you, madam? Always pays in cash, she does. Very organised about her household accounts." Miss Marple observed the slight stiffening in Mrs. Fairfax's posture at this revelation. Cash payments were not unusual in a village shop, certainly, but combined with the wedding dress and the vague family connections, they formed an intriguing pattern. "The dress is quite beautiful," Miss Marple said gently. "70s, I would guess." "The style is unmistakable. You must have been a lovely bride." The silence that followed this innocent comment stretched just a moment too long. When Mrs. Fairfax finally spoke, her voice had acquired a harder edge. "I wear it to honour a promise," she said simply. "Some commitments transcend time, don't you think, Miss Marple?" There was something in the way she said it that made Miss Marple's instincts prickle with interest. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that people who made grand statements about eternal devotion were often harbouring secrets of a rather different nature entirely. "How romantic," Miss Marple murmured. though her keen eyes were noting other details. The way Mrs. Fairfax handled the dress, for instance, seemed curiously careless for someone who supposedly treasured it as a monument to lost love. She allowed the train to drag across the somewhat dusty shop floor without concern, and when she reached for items on higher shelves, she showed no particular care for the delicate fabric. Mr. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Will there be anything else today, Mrs. Fairfax?" "Just these items, thank you." She placed several tins and a loaf of bread on the counter, then withdrew a leather purse from beneath the dress's voluminous folds. Miss Marple noticed that the purse was modern and practical, quite at odds with the vintage ensemble. As Mrs. Fairfax counted out the exact change, Miss Marple found herself studying the woman's hands more closely. They were well cared for, but showed signs of recent gardening, with traces of soil beneath the nails. Curious, for someone who might be expected to treat her person with the same reverence she supposedly accorded her dress. "I do hope we'll see you at church on Sunday," Miss Marple said as Mrs. Fairfax gathered her purchases. "The vicar gives such thoughtful sermons, and the congregation is always welcoming to newcomers." "Oh, I attend regularly," Mrs. Fairfax replied, adjusting her veil slightly. "I find great comfort in the services. Faith has been my anchor through difficult times." With that, she swept from the shop, her train making a soft whisking sound against the doorframe as she passed. Mr. Fletcher watched her go, then turned to Miss Marple with an expression of barely suppressed curiosity. "Odd sort, isn't she? Pleasant enough, mind you, but one does wonder about a person who dresses like that for everyday errands." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, "though I suppose we all have our ways of coping with life's disappointments." She completed her own modest purchases while her mind turned over the encounter. There had been something not quite right about Mrs. Fairfax, though she couldn't yet put her finger on what exactly troubled her. The woman's story seemed straightforward enough, a bride abandoned at the altar, clinging to her wedding dress as a symbol of faith and devotion. Such things happened, certainly, and people responded to heartbreak in various ways. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous mysteries often hid behind the most conventional facades. As she walked home along the village lanes, her basket filled with her modest purchases, she found herself thinking about promises and the different ways people chose to honour them. In her experience, those who made the greatest show of their virtue were often the ones with the most to hide. The woman in the wedding dress would bear watching, Miss Marple decided. In a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of revealing themselves, given time and careful observation. After all, human nature was remarkably consistent, no matter how elaborately it might disguise itself. Chapter 2. The Wedding That Never Was. The mysteries of St. Mary Mead have always had a way of revealing themselves in the most ordinary of settings, and it was over a perfectly conventional cup of tea in the vicarage parlour that Miss Marple first heard the full story of Constance Fairfax's romantic tragedy. Or rather, what purported to be the full story, for as any student of human nature knows, the tales we tell about ourselves are often the most carefully constructed fictions of all. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had invited Miss Marple for afternoon tea with that particular air of barely contained excitement that suggested information of considerable interest was about to be shared. The autumn light filtering through the vicarage windows cast a warm glow over the familiar scene of delicate china and homemade scones. But Miss Marple's attention was entirely focused on her hostess's animated expression. "You simply must hear what I've learned about our mysterious bride," Mrs. Clement began, settling her ample form more comfortably in her chair. "I had the most extraordinary conversation with her after morning service on Sunday. The poor dear quite opened her heart to me." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm, but her pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "How kind of you to provide a sympathetic ear. I imagine it must be difficult for her, being new to the village and carrying such obvious grief." "Oh, but that's just it," Mrs. Clement exclaimed, leaning forward conspiratorially. "It's not grief at all, my dear Miss Marple. It's rage. Pure, concentrated rage, disguised as devotion." The knitting needles paused for just a moment before resuming their gentle clicking. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most revealing conversations often began with such dramatic pronouncements. "Do tell me more," she encouraged gently. Mrs. Clement needed no further invitation. According to Mrs. Fairfax, she was to be married 20 years ago, in 1975, to a gentleman named Richard Pemberton. The wedding was planned for St. Mary Mead, which struck me as rather odd, since I've been keeping the church records for 15 years now, and I was quite certain we'd had no such ceremony. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Memory can be unreliable, of course, but church records tend to be rather precise about such matters. Precisely what I thought, Mrs. Clement agreed. But when I mentioned this to Mrs. Fairfax, she became quite defensive, said perhaps it was the church in Little Wickham, or possibly St. Anne's in Maidbridge, rather vague about the details which seemed curious for what should have been the most important day of her life. The vicar himself appeared at this moment, having finished his afternoon visits to the parish shut-ins. Reverend Clement was a gentle soul with thinning hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, but he possessed the particular insight into human nature that came from years of hearing confessions and comforting the troubled. "Ah, my dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, settling into his favourite armchair. "I trust my wife has been regaling you with tales of our enigmatic parishioner." "Indeed she has," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess I'm rather puzzled by the whole affair. A woman clinging to her wedding dress for 20 years suggests either extraordinary devotion or something rather more complex." Reverend Clement exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife. "I'm afraid it's the latter, Miss Marple. You see, I've spoken with Mrs. Fairfax on several occasions now, and there's something about her manner when she discusses this Richard Pemberton that troubles me greatly." He paused to accept a cup of tea from his wife before continuing. "She speaks of him with such venom, such bitter hatred, that it seems far removed from the heartbreak of an abandoned bride. When she describes how he left her standing at the altar, her eyes fairly blaze with fury. It's most unsettling." Miss Marple's fingers worked methodically at her knitting as she processed this information. "And what exactly did he do, according to her account?" "Disappeared on the morning of their wedding," Mrs. Clement interjected. "Left only a note saying he couldn't go through with it, and that he was sorry. Never seen or heard from again, she claims. Simply vanished, leaving her to face the humiliation alone." "How terrible for her," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she was reserving judgment on the veracity of the tale. Reverend Clement leaned forward slightly. "The curious thing, Miss Marple, is that when I suggested she might find peace in forgiveness, she became quite agitated. Said some people didn't deserve forgiveness, that some betrayals were too great to overlook. There was something in her voice that made me rather uncomfortable." Miss Marple nodded slowly. In her long experience she had observed that genuine heartbreak, even when it festered for years, retained a certain quality of sadness. Hatred, on the other hand, was an entirely different emotion, one that consumed rather than mourned. "Has she mentioned anything about her life before coming to St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple inquired. "One would assume a woman of her apparent breeding would have had friends, connections, some sort of social circle." Mrs. Clement shook her head. "Remarkably reticent about her past, actually. When I asked about her family, she mentioned only the great-aunt who left her the cottage. No siblings, no friends, no mention of employment or interests, rather as if her life began and ended with this Richard Pemberton." This struck Miss Marple as particularly odd. In her observation, even the most private individuals usually revealed something of their histories in casual conversation. A mention of school days, perhaps, or a fondness for particular places or activities. Complete silence about one's past was often more revealing than the most detailed autobiography. "I took the liberty of checking our old parish records," Reverend Clement admitted somewhat sheepishly. "Not from idle curiosity, you understand, but because I felt it might help me counsel her more effectively. There's no record of any Fairfax family in this area 20 years ago, despite her claims of local connections." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "How very interesting. And what of the cottage itself? Surely someone would remember Millicent Fairfax having family." "That's perhaps the oddest part of all," Mrs. Clement said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've spoken to several of the older residents, people who would certainly have known Miss Fairfax. They all remember her as being quite specific about having no living relatives. She used to say, rather proudly, that she was the last of her line." The three sat in contemplative silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. "There's something else," Reverend Clement said finally. "Yesterday, after evening service, I saw Mrs. Fairfax in the churchyard. She was standing by Millicent Fairfax's grave, but she wasn't mourning. She appeared to be, well, I hesitate to say this, but she seemed to be gloating. Miss Marple's hands stilled completely. Gloating? There's no other word for it. She had a satisfied expression, almost triumphant. When she noticed me watching, she quickly adopted a more appropriate demeanour, but for that brief moment, he shook his head. It was most unsettling. Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and placed it in her bag. The afternoon had provided much food for thought, and she found herself increasingly convinced that Mrs. Constance Fairfax was not quite what she appeared to be. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that I shall make a point of getting to know our mysterious bride rather better. In my experience, people who construct elaborate stories about their past often have quite compelling reasons for doing so." As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to mistake performance for truth. The woman in the wedding dress was certainly performing, but the question remained, for whose benefit and to what end? The mysteries of the human heart, she mused, were often far more complex than they appeared on the surface, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, where secrets had a way of surfacing like autumn leaves, disturbed by an unexpected wind, the truth would eventually reveal itself. After all, as Miss Marple had learned through decades of careful observation, the most elaborate deceptions were often the most fragile, requiring constant maintenance to prevent their inevitable collapse. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Inheritance. In the gentle art of village investigation, one learns that the most revealing conversations often occur in the most mundane of circumstances. It was while deadheading her roses on a particularly pleasant Thursday morning that Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who arrived with that particular breathlessness that indicated news of considerable importance was about to be shared. "Jane, my dear," Mrs. Bantry announced, settling herself on the garden bench with the air of one preparing for a lengthy discourse, "you'll never guess what I've discovered about our mysterious bride." Miss Marple continued her careful ministrations to a particularly stubborn rose hip, but her attention was entirely focused on her friend's animated expression. In her long experience, information gathered through the village network was often more reliable than any formal investigation. "Do tell, Dolly," she said encouragingly, though she suspected she could guess the general direction of the revelation. "Well," Mrs. Bantry began, arranging her skirts with theatrical precision, "you know how curious I've always been about Ivy Cottage, and poor old Millicent Fairfax. Such a recluse in her final years, and always so insistent about having no family. So naturally, when this supposed great-niece appeared, I felt compelled to do a bit of investigating." Miss Marple smiled gently. Mrs. Bantry's investigations were legendary in St. Mary Mead, conducted with the thoroughness of a trained detective and the social connections of a long-time resident. "I had tea yesterday with Mrs. Carmichael," Mrs. Bantry continued, "and she told me the most extraordinary thing. Apparently Mrs. Fairfax explained her inheritance quite thoroughly when Mrs. Carmichael inquired about her sudden good fortune. Mrs. Carmichael, Miss Marple recalled, lived in the cottage adjacent to Ivy Cottage and had been Millicent Fairfax's closest neighbour, though close was rather a relative term given the deceased woman's hermit-like tendencies. According to our bride," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "she inherited everything from dear Aunt Millicent, who apparently remembered her fondly, despite years of separation. The cottage, a substantial sum of money and quite a collection of valuable antiques." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "How fortunate for her, though I must say it seems rather generous for someone who supposedly had no contact with her great-niece." "Precisely what I thought," Mrs. Bantry agreed triumphantly. "But here's the truly interesting part. Mrs. Carmichael remembered Millicent being quite specific about her lack of family. Used to say it regularly, apparently, whenever anyone asked about relatives or inheritance plans. 'No family to trouble themselves over an old woman's possessions,' she would say." Miss Marple carefully snipped another dead bloom, her mind working over this information. In her experience, elderly people were rarely vague about their family connections, particularly when it came to matters of inheritance. "Did Mrs. Carmichael notice anything unusual about Millicent's final months?" Miss Marple inquired. "Oh yes, indeed she did," Mrs. Bantry replied, clearly relishing her role as bearer of significant intelligence. "Millicent became quite confused toward the end, poor soul. Mrs. Carmichael mentioned several instances where she seemed to forget who people were, or would become agitated about visitors she claimed to have had but whom no one else remembered seeing. This struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Elderly people in declining mental states were often vulnerable to manipulation by those clever enough to exploit their confusion. "I don't suppose Mrs. Carmichael noticed any actual visitors during that period?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bantry's expression grew more animated. As a matter of fact, she did. About 6 months before Millicent died, she began mentioning a dear niece who had been writing to her. Mrs. Carmichael never saw this person, mind you, but Millicent would speak of her quite fondly, saying how wonderful it was to discover family after all these years. Miss Marple set down her gardening shears and gave Mrs. Bantry her full attention. How very convenient for Mrs. Fairfax that her great-aunt should suddenly remember having family just when she was becoming mentally fragile. "Exactly what I thought," Mrs. Bantry said with satisfaction. "And there's more. I made inquiries with Mr. Hartwell at the solicitor's office. Mr. Hartwell had been handling legal matters for St. Mary Mead residents for nearly 20 years, and his discretion was legendary. The fact that Mrs. Bantry had managed to extract information from him suggested either remarkable persistence or information of considerable public interest. Mr. Hartwell confirmed that he handled the inheritance," Mrs. Bantry continued, "and he mentioned that Mrs. Fairfax arrived with quite comprehensive documentation proving her relationship to Millicent, birth certificates, family records, even old photographs, remarkably well preserved for someone who claimed to have had little contact with the family." Miss Marple found this detail particularly intriguing. In her observation, people who maintained detailed family documentation despite years of separation often had specific reasons for doing so. "Did Mr. Hartwell seem satisfied with the documentation?" she asked. Mrs. Bantry hesitated for a moment. "That's where it becomes rather interesting, Jane. He said the paperwork was unusually comprehensive, almost as if it had been prepared specifically for legal purposes, rather than kept for sentimental reasons. But everything appeared to be in order, so he processed the inheritance." Miss Marple resumed her garden work, though her movements were now somewhat mechanical, as her mind processed this information. The picture emerging of Mrs. Constance Fairfax was becoming increasingly complex and not entirely pleasant. "I wonder," she mused aloud, "whether anyone has made inquiries about Mrs. Fairfax's background before she arrived in St. Mary Mead." "Funny you should mention that," Mrs. Bantry said with evident satisfaction. "I took the liberty of asking around in some of the neighbouring villages. After all, if she's local to the area, someone should remember the Fairfax family." Miss Marple smiled at her friend's thoroughness. "And what did you discover?" "Absolutely nothing," Mrs. Bantry replied dramatically. "No one in Little Wickham, Maidbridge, or even as far as Upper Thornfield has any memory of a Fairfax family with daughters named Constance. Rather odd, don't you think, for someone who claims local connections?" Indeed it was, Miss Marple reflected. In rural communities, families were remembered for generations, particularly those with unusual circumstances like abandoned brides who maintained such dramatic demonstrations of their grief. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Bantry added, her voice dropping to an even more confidential whisper. "Mrs. Carmichael mentioned that during Millicent's final illness, she became quite agitated about someone trying to change her will. She kept insisting that she had no family and didn't want anyone claiming her property under false pretenses." Miss Marple's hand stilled completely. How very distressing for the poor woman. "Yes, and here's the curious part. When Mrs. Carmichael suggested calling Dr. Haydock to help calm Millicent's anxiety, the old woman became quite lucid for a moment and said something very strange. She said, 'They think I'm too confused to know the difference between truth and lies, but I remember everything. I remember who I really am, and who they really are too.'" The two women sat in contemplative silence for a moment, the autumn garden seeming suddenly less peaceful than it had appeared moments before. "It does rather suggest," Miss Marple said finally, "that Mrs. Fairfax's inheritance may not be quite as straightforward as it appears." Mrs. Bantry nodded emphatically. "My thoughts exactly. And there's something else that troubles me, Jane. The cottage and its contents represent quite a substantial inheritance. The antiques alone must be worth several £1,000s, and the cottage itself is in excellent condition. Rather a windfall for someone who appeared to have no previous connection to the deceased. Miss Marple carefully gathered her gardening tools, her mind working over the implications of what she had learned. The pattern emerging suggested a carefully orchestrated deception, but the question remained. Who exactly was Mrs. Constance Fairfax, and what had really happened to Millicent Fairfax in her final months? "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that I shall pay a social call on Mrs. Fairfax very soon. One learns so much more about people in their own homes than in chance encounters at the village shop." As Mrs. Bantry departed with promises to share any additional intelligence she might gather, Miss Marple remained in her garden, ostensibly continuing her work, but actually deep in contemplation. In her long experience, people who constructed elaborate false identities usually had compelling reasons for doing so, and those reasons were rarely benign. The woman in the wedding dress was hiding something significant, Miss Marple was now certain. The question was whether her deception was merely mercenary, or whether it concealed something far more sinister. After all, as she had observed many times before, those who would deceive vulnerable elderly people for financial gain were often capable of considerably worse crimes when their schemes were threatened with exposure. Chapter 4. The First Suspicious Death. The news arrived with the morning post, delivered not by the usual postman but by young Tommy Fletcher, who had been pressed into service as messenger due to the extraordinary nature of the circumstances. Miss Marple was enjoying her customary morning tea and toast when the boy's excited knock interrupted the peaceful rhythm of her day. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple!" Tommy called through the door, his voice carrying that particular breathlessness that accompanies the delivery of momentous news. "My father sent me to tell you, Mr. Hartwell's been found dead in his office." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the careful precision that had become second nature over decades of receiving unexpected information. In her long experience, sudden deaths in small villages were rarely as straightforward as they initially appeared, particularly when they involved individuals who had recently been asking inconvenient questions. "How very sad," she murmured, opening the door to the excited boy. "Do come in, Tommy, and tell me what you know." Tommy Fletcher, barely 14 and thoroughly overwhelmed by his role as bearer of dramatic tidings, fairly burst with information. Dr. Haydock found him this morning when Mrs. Henderson couldn't raise anyone at the office. Just sitting at his desk he was, like he'd fallen asleep over his papers, but Dr. Haydock says it was his heart. Gave out sudden like. Miss Marple invited the boy to sit and provided him with a glass of milk and a biscuit, understanding that the shock of such news required both nourishment and a sympathetic ear. In her observation, young people often noticed details that adults overlooked, being less influenced by assumptions about what they should or shouldn't see. "How terrible for poor Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, "and so unexpected. Mr. Hartwell always seemed to be in excellent health." "That's just what everyone's saying," Tommy replied, his eyes wide with the drama of it all. "Never had so much as a day's illness, according to my father. Strong as an ox he was, and not yet 60. Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm as she processed this information. In her experience, healthy men in their prime rarely succumb to sudden heart failure without warning signs, particularly when they had recently been involved in matters of some delicacy. "I don't suppose anyone knows exactly when it happened?" she inquired casually. Tommy nodded eagerly. "Dr. Haydock thinks it must have been yesterday evening, after office hours. Mrs. Henderson found the door unlocked this morning, which she said was most unusual. Mr. Hartwell was very particular about securing the office, especially with all those important papers about." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A meticulous man like Mr. Hartwell would hardly have left his office unlocked unless he had been expecting someone, or unless he had been prevented from following his usual routine. After Tommy departed to continue his rounds as temporary town crier, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious timing of Mr. Hartwell's demise. It had been only yesterday that Mrs. Bantry had mentioned the solicitor's growing questions about Mrs. Fairfax's documentation, In Miss Marple's long experience, such coincidences were rarely coincidental. She was still pondering these matters when Dr. Haydock himself appeared at her door, looking considerably more grave than usual. The good doctor had been tending to the health of St. Mary Mead's residents for over 20 years, and his usually cheerful demeanour was notably subdued. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, accepting her invitation for tea with evident gratitude. "I suppose you've heard about poor Hartwell?" "Young Tommy Fletcher brought the news," Miss Marple confirmed, settling herself opposite the doctor with her teacup balanced perfectly in her lap. "Such a shock for everyone. I understand it was his heart." Dr. Haydock's expression grew troubled. "Well, that's what the evidence suggests, certainly. All the classic signs of sudden cardiac arrest. But I must confess, Miss Marple, there are aspects of the situation that I find rather puzzling." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm, but her attention was entirely focused on the doctor's words. In her experience, medical men were not given to dramatic pronouncements without substantial cause. "In what way puzzling?" she asked gently. Dr. Haydock set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly. "Well, for one thing, Hartwell's expression when I found him. I've seen many cases of sudden heart failure, Miss Marple, and the victims typically show signs of pain or distress. But Hartwell looked, well, shocked, terrified even, as if he'd seen something that frightened him beyond measure." This observation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the circumstances surrounding the solicitor's death. Fear was a powerful emotion, capable of triggering physical responses in even the healthiest individuals. "And there's another thing," Dr. Haydock continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "When I examined the office, I noticed that several of the filing cabinets appeared to have been disturbed. Papers were slightly out of order, drawers not quite closed properly. Nothing dramatic, mind you, but noticeable to someone familiar with Hartwell's obsessive organisational habits." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "How very interesting. I don't suppose Inspector Slack has been informed of these observations?" Dr. Haydock's expression grew somewhat rueful. "I mentioned them, of course, but you know how the inspector feels about what he calls unnecessary complications. Natural causes, case closed, no need for further investigation." Miss Marple was indeed familiar with Inspector Slack's preference for straightforward explanations, regardless of whether they adequately addressed all the available evidence. In her observation, the inspector's desire for administrative tidiness often trumped his investigative curiosity. "I wonder," she mused aloud, "whether Mr. Hartwell had any appointments scheduled for yesterday evening?" Dr. Haydock's expression brightened slightly. "Funny you should ask. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that his appointment book showed a meeting scheduled for 5:30, but the name was rather oddly written, almost as if it had been added hastily in different ink from his usual entries." Miss Marple's fingers worked more quickly at her knitting as she considered this information. An appointment added at the last minute, an unlocked office, and a man dead of apparent fear. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly troubling. "You don't suppose Mrs. Henderson noticed who this last-minute appointment was with?" Miss Marple inquired. "She did indeed, Doctor," Haydock replied, his expression growing more serious. "It was with Mrs. Constance Fairfax." The name hung in the air between them like a physical presence, confirming Miss Marple's darkest suspicions about the woman in the wedding dress. In her long experience, people who constructed elaborate deceptions to obtain inheritances were often prepared to go to considerable lengths to protect their fraudulent gains. "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that Mrs. Fairfax bears rather closer observation than we might have previously supposed." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly. Though I fear Inspector Slack will require rather more concrete evidence before he'll consider the possibility that Hartwell's death was anything other than natural." After the doctor departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden despite the cooling air, her mind working over the implications of what she had learned. The pattern was becoming clear. Mr. Hartwell had been asking questions about Mrs. Fairfax's documentation, had scheduled a meeting with her, and had died shortly thereafter under suspicious circumstances. His office had been searched, presumably for the very documents that had raised his concerns. In her long study of human nature, Miss Marple had observed that people who would commit fraud against vulnerable elderly individuals were often capable of considerably more serious crimes when their schemes were threatened with exposure. The question now was not whether Mrs. Fairfax was dangerous, but rather how dangerous she might prove to be, and whether anyone else in St. Mary Mead might find themselves in similar peril. The woman in the wedding dress, it seemed, was prepared to kill to protect her secrets. And in Miss Marple's experience, once someone had crossed that particular line, subsequent murders became disturbingly easy to justify. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, she reflected, was about to become considerably less peaceful indeed. Chapter 5. The Dress That Tells Stories. One learns a great deal about people by watching, by listening, not through grand gestures, but in the smallest of moments. A hesitation, a quick glance, the way someone arranges themselves when they think no one is observing. And when it comes to clothing, particularly a garment worn with such theatrical consistency as Mrs. Fairfax's wedding dress, the careful observer can discern stories that the wearer never intended to tell. Miss Marple had always possessed what her dear departed Raymond would have called an eye for detail, though she preferred to think of it simply as natural curiosity combined with a lifetime of careful observation. It was this particular talent that led her to position herself strategically in the church pew on Sunday morning, armed with her prayer book and a small pair of opera glasses discreetly concealed in her handbag. The congregation of St. Mary Mead had grown accustomed to their mysterious bride over the past months, but Miss Marple approached her observation with fresh eyes, determined to see what others might have overlooked through familiarity. What she discovered proved far more intriguing than even her suspicious nature had anticipated. Mrs. Fairfax entered the church with her usual dramatic flourish, the yellowed satin rustling against the ancient stone floors as she made her way to her customary pew near the front. From Miss Marple's advantageous position 3 rows behind, the wedding dress presented itself for detailed examination in the morning light, streaming through the stained glass windows. The first thing Miss Marple noticed, now that she was looking with purposeful intent, were the stains, subtle, carefully positioned to be concealed by strategic accessories and clever draping, but unmistakably present. There was a small discoloration near the left shoulder, partially hidden beneath a vintage brooch that seemed oddly out of place with the dress's original design. Another mark, darker and more concerning, was barely visible along the dress's train, masked by the way Mrs. Fairfax arranged the fabric when she sat. But it was the alterations that proved most revealing. Miss Marple had spent decades observing fashion and its variations, and her practised eye immediately detected the signs of significant modification. The dress had been shortened, and not merely hemmed for length. The proportions were subtly wrong, suggesting that it had originally been worn by someone considerably taller than its current occupant. During the hymn singing, where Mrs. Fairfax rose and the dress fell to its full length, Miss Marple observed something else of considerable interest. The way the woman moved in the garment suggested unfamiliarity, rather than the comfortable ease one might expect from someone who had supposedly worn it for 20 years. There was a subtle awkwardness, a consciousness of the fabric that spoke of recent adoption rather than long-term wear. The veil, too, told its own story. While the dress itself showed signs of careful maintenance, the veil had clearly suffered some form of damage that had been painstakingly repaired. The mesh had been rewoven in several places, and the attachment point showed evidence of having been torn away and restitched. Miss Marple found herself wondering what violent incident might have necessitated such extensive repairs. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the autumn sunshine, Miss Marple positioned herself to observe Mrs. Fairfax's interactions with her fellow parishioners. What struck her most forcefully was how the woman handled the dress during casual conversation. She gathered the train carelessly, allowed it to brush against dusty surfaces, and showed none of the protective reverence one might expect from someone treasuring a garment of such supposed emotional significance. It was then that Miss Marple noticed something that made her heart skip slightly. As Mrs. Fairfax bent to speak to young Mrs. Peterson's toddler, the neckline of the dress gaped slightly, revealing what appeared to be a small but distinctive scar just below her collarbone. The mark was pale with age but clearly visible, and it struck Miss Marple as oddly familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen such a thing before. The following Tuesday provided an opportunity for more detailed observation, when Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Fairfax in the village post office. The small space forced closer proximity than usual, and Miss Marple found herself able to examine the dress's construction with unprecedented clarity. The fabric itself was indeed authentic 1970s satin, but the stitching told a complex story. The original seamwork was machine perfect, clearly the product of professional dressmaking. But overlaying this were numerous hand-stitched modifications, repairs, and alterations that spoke of recent and somewhat desperate adaptation. Someone had worked very hard to make this dress fit its current wearer, and the results, while skillful, could not entirely disguise the fundamental mismatch between garment and occupant. Miss Marple's attention was particularly drawn to the dress's waistline, which had been significantly altered. The original construction suggested a bride of entirely different proportions, taller, certainly, but also more slender through the torso. The current fit required extensive modification to accommodate Mrs. Fairfax's figure, modifications that had been executed with considerable skill but obvious haste. "Such a beautiful dress," Miss Marple commented casually as they waited in the brief queue. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. It must hold such precious memories for you." Mrs. Fairfax's response was immediate and telling. Her hands moved instinctively to smooth the fabric, but the gesture was protective rather than loving, as if she were shielding the dress from scrutiny rather than displaying a treasured memento. "Yes," she replied, though her voice lacked the warmth one might expect from someone discussing their wedding attire. "It represents everything I hold dear." But Miss Marple noticed that as she spoke, Mrs. Fairfax's fingers worried at a small area near the dress's bodice, where the fabric had been carefully mended. The gesture was unconscious but revealing, suggesting anxiety rather than affection. That evening, as Miss Marple tended to her own modest wardrobe, hanging up her Sunday dress and arranging her everyday clothes with the care of someone who understood the value of well-maintained garments, she reflected on what she'd observed. In her long experience, clothing was often more honest than its wearer. A garment carried the history of its use, the evidence of its care or neglect, the subtle signs of its true relationship with the person who wore it. The wedding dress was telling a story, but it was not the story Mrs. Fairfax wanted the world to hear. It spoke of violence and alteration, of hasty adaptation and careful concealment. Most significantly, it suggested that its current wearer was not its original owner, and that the circumstances of its acquisition had been far from romantic. Miss Marple had seen enough theatrical performances in her time to recognise when someone was wearing a costume rather than their own clothes, and Mrs. Constance Fairfax, whatever her real name might be, was most certainly playing a role. The question that remained was whether this performance was merely the elaborate fantasy of a disturbed individual, or whether it concealed something far more sinister. Given recent events, particularly Mr. Hartwell's convenient demise, Miss Marple was increasingly inclined toward the latter interpretation. After all, as she had observed many times before, people who would steal another person's identity often had compelling reasons for abandoning their own, and in her experience such reasons were rarely innocent. The dress, she reflected, was not a symbol of eternal love but rather a trophy of successful deception. And like all trophies, it told the story of a victory that had come at someone else's expense. Chapter 6, The Missing Groom returns. There are moments in village life when the ordinary rhythm of daily existence is disrupted by events so extraordinary that they leave the entire community temporarily speechless. Such a moment arrived in St. Mary Mead on a particularly grey Thursday morning, delivered not by the usual channels of gossip and speculation, but by the simple expedient of a tall, distinguished gentleman walking into Fletcher's village shop and asking directions to Ivy Cottage. Miss Marple happened to be selecting her weekly provisions when this remarkable occurrence took place, and she found herself in the enviable position of being the first to witness what would undoubtedly become the most discussed event in recent village memory. The gentleman in question was perhaps 55 years of age, with a sort of bearing that suggested both good breeding and considerable anxiety. His clothes were well tailored but showed signs of recent travel, and he carried himself with the particular attention of someone who'd been searching for something important for a very long time. "Excuse me," he said to Mr. Fletcher, his voice carrying the cultured tones of excellent education, tinged with unmistakable nervousness. "I wonder if you might direct me to Ivy Cottage. I understand a Mrs. Constance Fairfax lives there now." The effect of this simple request was immediate and electric. Mr. Fletcher's eyes widened considerably, while Miss Marple found herself gripping her shopping basket with unusual firmness. The name Constance Fairfax, spoken by a strange gentleman asking for directions, carried implications that set every instinct a quiver with anticipation. "Ivy Cottage, you say?" Mr. Fletcher replied, his voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "Why, yes, indeed, Mrs. Fairfax does live there. Might I ask who's inquiring?" The gentleman hesitated for a moment, and Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his hat. Whatever had brought him to Saint Mary Mead, it was not a casual social call. "My name is Richard Pemberton," he said finally, and the simple statement landed in the shop's quiet atmosphere like a stone dropped into still water. Miss Marple's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but her mind was racing with the implications. Richard Pemberton, the faithless groom who had supposedly abandoned Constance at the altar 20 years ago. The man whose betrayal had, according to Mrs. Fairfax's oft-repeated tale, driven her to a lifetime of mourning dramatised by her perpetual wedding attire. Mr. Fletcher's jaw had dropped quite visibly, and he seemed momentarily incapable of coherent speech. Miss Marple, however, found her voice with admirable speed. "Mr. Pemberton," she said warmly, stepping forward with the gentle smile that had encouraged confidences for decades. "How very interesting to meet you. I'm Jane Marple, a local resident. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Mrs. Fairfax." Richard Pemberton turned toward her with an expression of profound relief, as if the discovery of a sympathetic ear was exactly what he had been hoping for. "Miss Marple," he said, extending his hand with evident gratitude. "How kind of you to introduce yourself. Yes, indeed, Constance and I have... well, we have a rather complicated history." Miss Marple's observational skills, honed by decades of careful attention to human behaviour, immediately detected several intriguing details about Mr. Pemberton's demeanour. His relief at finding someone willing to engage in conversation was genuine, but it was overlaid with something that looked remarkably like fear. His eyes held the particular wariness of someone who had been running from something for a very long time. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you might join me for tea? I imagine you have quite a story to tell, and Mrs. Fairfax's situation has been of some concern to those of us who care about the welfare of our neighbours." The gratitude in Richard Pemberton's expression was unmistakable. "Miss Marple, I would be more grateful than I can express. You see, I've been searching for the woman calling herself Constance for several months now, ever since I learned of her whereabouts through newspaper coverage of her rather unusual lifestyle." This revelation sent a small thrill of anticipation through Miss Marple's consciousness. Newspaper coverage suggested that Mrs. Fairfax's theatrical mourning had attracted attention beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead, which raised interesting questions about her motivations for such conspicuous behaviour. 20 minutes later, settled comfortably in Miss Marple's sitting room with tea and homemade scones, Richard Pemberton began to unfold a tale that was far more complex and considerably more disturbing than anyone in St. Mary Mead had imagined. "The woman living in Ivy Cottage is not Constance Fairfax," he began without preamble, his voice carrying the conviction of absolute certainty. "Constance was my fiancée, yes, and we were indeed to be married in 1975. But the woman wearing her wedding dress is her sister Margaret." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm, but her attention was completely focused on this extraordinary revelation. "Her sister?" "Yes," Richard continued, his hands clasping and unclasping as he spoke. "Margaret was always jealous of Constance. Bitterly, obsessively jealous. Constance was everything Margaret wanted to be. Beautiful, kind, beloved by everyone who knew her. But Margaret—" He paused, struggling with painful memories. Margaret was consumed by envy. The picture Richard painted was deeply unsettling. According to his account, Margaret had spent years systematically undermining her sister's happiness, spreading malicious gossip, sabotaging relationships, and creating discord wherever possible. But her jealousy had reached its peak with Constance's engagement to Richard. "I began to receive anonymous letters," Richard explained, warning me about Constance's supposed infidelities, her alleged dishonesty, her family's supposedly shameful secrets. At first I dismissed them, but they became increasingly detailed and convincing. I'm ashamed to admit that I began to have doubts." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. In her long observation of human nature, she had seen how skillfully malicious individuals could plant seeds of doubt in even the most trusting relationships. "It was only later that I discovered Margaret was the author of those letters," Richard continued, "but by then it was too late. Constance had died in a car accident just 3 days after our wedding." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "You were married?" "Oh, yes," Richard replied, his voice heavy with old grief. "The ceremony took place in St. Anne's Church in Maidbridge, not here in St. Mary Mead as Margaret now claims. We had a beautiful wedding, and for 3 days Constance and I were blissfully happy. Then she was killed in what the police determined was an accident, though I've always had my suspicions." The implications of this revelation were staggering. If Richard's story was true, then the woman calling herself Constance Fairfax was not only an imposter, but potentially a murderer as well. "Margaret was at the funeral, of course," Richard continued. "She seemed genuinely grief-stricken, and I felt sorry for her, losing her only sister. But shortly afterward, she disappeared. I assumed she was simply dealing with her grief in her own way." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And you had no contact with her after that?" "None," Richard confirmed, "until about a year ago, when I began receiving reports of suspicious deaths among elderly people in various counties. The victims all died of apparent natural causes, but they had all recently changed their wills to benefit previously unknown relatives. When I investigated further, I discovered that Margaret was involved in each case, though she used different names and identities." The pattern Richard described was chillingly familiar to Miss Marple, matching perfectly with her own suspicions about Mrs. Fairfax's inheritance from Millicent Fairfax. "I've been trying to gather enough evidence to expose her," Richard explained, "but she's been very clever about covering her tracks. When I learned about her residence here in St. Mary Mead, I knew I had to confront her directly." Miss Marple observed the very real fear in Richard's eyes as he spoke of confronting the woman he believed to be a serial killer. His courage in coming forward was admirable, but she couldn't help wondering whether he fully appreciated the danger he was placing himself in. "Mr. Pemberton," she said gently, "I hope you'll be very careful in your dealings with Mrs. Fairfax. Recent events in our village suggest that she may be more dangerous than even you realise." Richard's expression grew even more grave. "Recent events?" Miss Marple briefly outlined the suspicious circumstances surrounding Mr. Hartwell's death, and she watched as Richard's face went pale with understanding. "Then I may already be too late," he said quietly. "If she's willing to kill to protect her current identity, she certainly won't hesitate to eliminate someone who knows the truth about her past." As Richard Pemberton departed to check into the local inn, Miss Marple found herself deeply troubled by what she had learned. The woman in the wedding dress was not merely a fraud, but potentially a serial killer who had been systematically murdering elderly people for their inheritances. And now, the one person who could definitively expose her identity had arrived in St. Mary Mead. The question now was not whether Mrs. Fairfax would attempt to silence Richard Pemberton, but rather how quickly she would act, and whether anyone would be able to prevent another tragedy from unfolding in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. The Second Death. There are mornings in village life when the very air seems to whisper of impending tragedy, when the ordinary sounds of awakening households carry an undertone of something darker waiting to unfold. Friday morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with just such an atmosphere, though none could have predicted how thoroughly the day would justify their vague unease. Miss Marple was enjoying her customary morning tea when the urgent knocking at her door announced the arrival of catastrophe. This time, however, it was not young Tommy Fletcher who served as messenger, but rather Mrs. Bantry herself, appearing at the threshold with her hair still in curling papers and her coat thrown hastily over her nightgown. "Jane," she gasped without preamble or polite greeting, "that gentleman who arrived yesterday, Mr. Pemberton, he's been found dead in his hotel room at the Blue Boar." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the careful precision that had become her response to shocking news, though her mind was already racing through the implications of this development. In her long experience, the death of inconvenient witnesses rarely qualified as coincidence, particularly when those witnesses possessed information capable of exposing elaborate deceptions. "How very tragic," she murmured, opening the door wider to admit her distraught friend. "Do come in, Dolly, and tell me what you know." Mrs. Bantry fairly collapsed into the offered chair, her usual composure entirely abandoned in the face of such dramatic circumstances. Dr. Haydock found him this morning, when the hotel staff couldn't raise any response to their knocking. Apparently he'd ordered breakfast to be brought up at 8 o'clock, but when they knocked, there was no answer. Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea and pressed it into Mrs. Bantry's trembling hands, understanding that shock required both warmth and gentle encouragement to reveal its full story. "Another heart attack, I suppose?" Miss Marple inquired, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer would prove more complex than such a simple explanation. "That's what Dr. Haydock says," Mrs. Bantry confirmed, though her expression carried the same troubled uncertainty that had marked the doctor's assessment of Mr. Hartwell's demise. "But Jane, the similarities are quite remarkable. The same expression of shock and fear, the same signs that his room had been searched, though nothing appeared to be missing." Miss Marple's knitting needles began their familiar rhythm as she processed this information. 2 healthy men, both connected to Mrs. Fairfax, both dead of apparent heart failure, under circumstances that suggested considerable distress. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. "I don't suppose anyone knows exactly when Mr. Pemberton died?" she asked. Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly. "Dr. Haydock estimates it was sometime between 9 and 11 last evening. And here's the most peculiar thing, Jane. Mrs. Fairfax has a perfect alibi for the entire period." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. In her observation, perfect alibis were often more suspicious than imperfect ones, particularly when they involved individuals who might reasonably be suspected of foul play. "What sort of alibi?" she inquired. "She attended evening service at the church," Mrs. Bantry explained. "Reverend Clement confirmed it himself. She arrived early, sat in her usual pew, and remained throughout the entire service and the social hour that followed. Didn't leave until nearly 10:30, and even then she lingered to help Mrs. Clement arrange the flowers for Sunday's service." Miss Marple found this information deeply troubling rather than exonerating. In her long study of criminal behaviour, she'd observed that the most dangerous killers were often those clever enough to establish seemingly unshakable alibis while somehow managing to commit their crimes through other means. "How very public-spirited of her," Miss Marple observed dryly. "And I suppose her distinctive wedding dress made her quite impossible to overlook during this period." "Exactly," Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "Half the congregation would be willing to swear that she never left the church premises. But Jane, if she didn't kill Mr. Pemberton, then who did? And why?" Miss Marple's mind was working through the possibilities, considering various scenarios that might explain how Mrs. Fairfax could have been in two places at once. In her experience, seemingly impossible crimes often had quite practical explanations once one understood the methods employed. The arrival of Dr. Haydock himself interrupted her contemplations. The good doctor appeared at the door, looking considerably more disturbed than he had after Mr. Hartwell's death, carrying with him an air of professional frustration that suggested significant concerns about the official explanation for Mr. Pemberton's demise. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting her invitation for tea with evident relief, "I'm beginning to feel like the village harbinger of doom. Two apparently healthy men, both dead under remarkably similar circumstances." Miss Marple settled herself opposite the doctor, her expression encouraging him to share whatever professional observations were troubling him. "The similarities are quite striking," Dr. Haydock continued. "Same expression of terror, same signs that the room had been systematically searched, same general time of death in the evening hours. But here's what I find most peculiar. In both cases there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the victims admitted their killer willingly." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing. Men like Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Pemberton, both intelligent and cautious individuals, would hardly have admitted strangers to their private spaces during evening hours. The killer was someone they trusted, or at least someone they had no reason to fear. "I don't suppose Mr. Pemberton mentioned any concerns about his safety?" Miss Marple inquired. Dr. Haydock's expression grew more troubled. "Actually, he did. He stopped by my surgery yesterday afternoon, complaining of feeling anxious and requesting something to help him sleep. Said he was worried about confronting someone from his past, someone who might not be pleased to see him." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Mrs. Bantry. Mr. Pemberton's anxiety had been well-founded, though his precautions had proved insufficient to protect him. "Did he mention any specific threats?" Miss Marple asked. "Not directly, Doctor," Haydock replied, "but he did say something rather odd. He said he was carrying documentation that would expose a very dangerous person, and that he hoped he would live long enough to share it with the proper authorities." The implications of this statement were chilling. Mr. Pemberton had possessed evidence capable of exposing Mrs. Fairfax's true identity and criminal activities, and now both he and his evidence had conveniently disappeared. "I suppose this documentation wasn't found among his belongings?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Haydock shook his head grimly. "That's just it. His room had been thoroughly searched, and while his personal effects remained largely undisturbed, any papers or documents had vanished completely. Even his hotel registration was missing from the front desk." Miss Marple reflected on the thoroughness of this evidence removal. Someone had taken considerable care to eliminate any trace of Mr. Pemberton's investigation, suggesting both guilty knowledge and criminal sophistication. "And Inspector Slack's assessment of the situation?" she asked. Dr. Haydock's expression grew somewhat rueful. "Natural causes, case closed. No need for further investigation. The inspector seems to view the deaths as an unfortunate coincidence rather than evidence of foul play." Miss Marple was not surprised by Inspector Slack's conclusion, though she found it deeply frustrating. In her observation, the inspector's preference for simple explanations often blinded him to more complex truths, particularly when those truths required sustained investigative effort. After her visitors departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden despite the grey morning, her mind working through the implications of what she'd learned. Mrs. Fairfax had managed to kill Mr. Pemberton while maintaining a perfect alibi. But the question remained, how had she accomplished this apparently impossible feat? In her long study of criminal behaviour, Miss Marple had learned that the most effective murderers were often those who understood how to manipulate circumstances to their advantage. Mrs. Fairfax had clearly planned Mr. Pemberton's death carefully, ensuring that her conspicuous presence at the church would make her an unlikely suspect. But Miss Marple had also learned that no crime was truly perfect, and that even the most careful criminals eventually made mistakes that exposed their guilt. The challenge was recognising those mistakes when they occurred and understanding their significance before more innocent lives were lost. The woman in the wedding dress, she reflected, was proving to be far more dangerous than anyone in St Mary Mead had imagined, and with 2 deaths already to her credit, there was no reason to assume she would hesitate to kill again if her secrets were threatened with exposure. The question now was not whether Mrs. Fairfax would strike again, but rather who would be her next victim, and whether anyone would be clever enough to stop her before she claimed another life in the quiet lanes of St Mary Mead. Chapter 8. The Truth About the Dress. One learns, through years of careful observation, that the truth has a particular way of asserting itself, rather like a determined weed pushing through the most carefully tended garden path. No amount of elaborate covering can suppress it indefinitely, and often it emerges in the most unexpected places. For Miss Marple, the truth about the wedding dress revealed itself not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient pursuit of parish records and the gentle persistence of an elderly woman with nothing but time and an insatiable curiosity about human nature. The morning after Mr. Pemberton's tragic demise found Miss Marple in an unusually determined frame of mind. The coincidence of 2 convenient deaths had moved far beyond the realm of possibility into the territory of deliberate murder, and she had no intention of allowing a 3rd victim to fall prey to the woman in the wedding dress. But first, she needed to understand exactly what had happened 20 years ago, and why that particular garment held such significance for its current wearer. Armed with her most persuasive smile and a carefully prepared list of questions, Miss Marple set out to visit the various parish churches in the surrounding counties. Her cover story was simple and believable. She was researching family history for a distant cousin, and hoped to locate records of a wedding that had taken place in the mid-1970s. The first 3 churches proved disappointingly unhelpful, their records either incomplete or unhelpfully organised. But St Anne's in Maidbridge, the very church Richard Pemberton had mentioned during their brief but illuminating conversation, proved to be a treasure trove of information that would reshape everything Miss Marple thought she knew about the case. The elderly verger, Mr. Hodgson, was delighted to assist such a charming visitor, and his memory proved remarkably sharp despite his advanced years. When Miss Marple mentioned the name Constance Fairfax, his face lit up with immediate recognition. "Oh, yes, indeed," he said, leading her to the church records with evident enthusiasm. A beautiful wedding it was, though terribly sad what happened afterward. Poor Miss Constance, dying so young, and just 3 days after her wedding to that nice Mr. Pemberton. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as the pieces began falling into place. She died 3 days after the wedding? Dreadful car accident, Mr. Hodgson confirmed, pulling out a leather-bound register and turning to the relevant entries. Here we are. Constance Mary Fairfax, married to Richard James Pemberton on the 15th of June, 1975. Beautiful ceremony, though I remember thinking at the time that the bride's sister seemed rather overwrought. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. The bride's sister? Margaret, I believe her name was, served as maid of honour, though she spent most of the ceremony weeping. We all assumed it was emotion at seeing her sister married, but, looking back, he shook his head sadly. There was something rather desperate about her behaviour, almost as if she were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. The significance of this observation was not lost on Miss Marple. Margaret's tears at her sister's wedding took on an entirely different meaning when viewed through the lens of subsequent events. "I don't suppose you have any photographs from the occasion?" Miss Marple inquired hopefully. Mr. Hodgson's face brightened. "As a matter of fact, I do. The church photographer took several pictures, and we keep copies in our archives. Would you like to see them?" The photographs, yellowed with age but still remarkably clear, told a story that confirmed Miss Marple's darkest suspicions. The bride, Constance, was indeed beautiful. Tall, slender, and radiant with happiness as she posed in her wedding dress. But it was the maid of honour who captured Miss Marple's attention. Margaret Fairfax stood beside her sister, shorter and more solidly built, her face twisted with what the casual observer might have mistaken for emotional overwhelm, but which Miss Marple now recognised as barely contained rage and jealousy. More significantly, the dress that Margaret wore as maid of honour was clearly too long for her, its hem pooling around her feet in a way that suggested it had been borrowed or hastily altered. Margaret was quite devoted to her sister, Mr. Hodgson commented, observing Miss Marple's careful study of the photographs. Perhaps too devoted, if you understand my meaning. There were whispers that she had hoped to marry Mr. Pemberton herself before he met Constance. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new detail. Margaret's obsession with her sister had clearly extended beyond mere sibling rivalry into the realm of dangerous possessiveness. "What happened after the accident?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Hodgson's expression grew sorrowful. Poor Mr. Pemberton was devastated, naturally. Left the area shortly after the funeral, couldn't bear the memories, I expect. And Margaret simply disappeared. No one knew where she'd gone, and frankly, no one was particularly surprised. She'd always been rather an odd sort, prone to dramatic gestures and strange fixations. The funeral records proved equally illuminating. Constance had been buried in her wedding dress, as was traditional for brides who died shortly after their marriages, but according to the funeral director's notes, there had been some confusion about the dress itself. The sister insisted on preparing the body personally, Mr. Hodgson explained, consulting the old records. Said it was her final act of devotion to poor Constance. But the funeral director mentioned that when the body was finally presented for burial, the dress seemed somehow different from the one worn at the wedding. Smaller, he thought, though he couldn't be certain. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. Margaret had taken her sister's wedding dress, leaving a substitute for the burial. The dress that now adorned the woman calling herself Constance Fairfax was not a cherished memento of lost love, but rather a trophy stolen from a murder victim. The accident itself, Miss Marple inquired carefully, was there any suggestion that it might not have been accidental? Mr. Hodgson's expression grew troubled. There were whispers at the time, though nothing was ever proven. Constance was an excellent driver, and the road where the accident occurred was one she knew well. But the car went off the road at a particularly dangerous curve, and by the time help arrived, she was already dead. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing certainty about what had really happened 20 years ago. Margaret had murdered her sister, stolen her identity along with her wedding dress, and then disappeared to begin a new life built on deception and theft. The alterations to the dress now made perfect sense. Margaret had shortened it to fit her smaller stature and modified the bodice to accommodate her different figure. The stains Miss Marple had observed were likely evidence of the violence that had accompanied its acquisition, while the careful repairs to the veil suggested it had been damaged during the struggle that preceded Constance's death. As Miss Marple made her way back to St. Mary Mead, her mind was working through the full implications of what she had discovered. The woman calling herself Constance Fairfax was actually Margaret, a murderer who had been systematically killing elderly people for their inheritances, while wearing her victim's wedding dress as both disguise and trophy. The dress itself was evidence of the original crime, but it was also the key to understanding Margaret's psychological state. She had not merely stolen her sister's identity, she had literally clothed herself in Constance's life, wearing the dress as a constant reminder of her victory over the happiness she had never been able to achieve for herself. Richard Pemberton's arrival in St. Mary Mead had threatened to expose this elaborate deception, and Margaret had killed him just as ruthlessly as she had killed her sister 20 years earlier. The question now was how to prove these crimes and prevent further murders, particularly when Inspector Slack seemed determined to view the recent deaths as natural occurrences rather than evidence of serial killing. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth, once discovered, had a way of asserting itself through the most unexpected channels. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as transient as morning mist, even the most carefully constructed deceptions eventually crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions. The dress had told its story at last, and Miss Marple was determined to ensure that its tale of murder and deception would finally receive the justice it demanded. After all, as she had observed many times before, some crimes cast shadows that stretch far beyond their original commission, and those shadows invariably lead the patient observer back to the truth, no matter how many years may have passed or how elaborate the attempts at concealment may have been. Chapter 9. The Sister's Identity. There are moments in the pursuit of truth when one must abandon the comfortable role of observer and step forward into the rather more perilous position of active participant. For Miss Marple, such a moment arrived on a particularly grey Saturday afternoon, as she sat in her garden contemplating the evidence she had so carefully assembled and the confrontation that could no longer be postponed. The facts, as she now understood them, painted a picture of such calculated evil that even her long experience of human wickedness found it rather breathtaking in scope. Margaret Fairfax had not merely killed her sister and assumed her identity. She had built an entire criminal enterprise on that foundation, systematically murdering elderly people across multiple counties while wearing Constance's wedding dress as both disguise and psychological trophy. But understanding the truth and proving it were entirely different matters, particularly when dealing with someone who had demonstrated such ruthless efficiency in eliminating inconvenient witnesses. Miss Marple knew that a direct confrontation with Margaret would be extraordinarily dangerous, but she also knew that without decisive action, more innocent lives would inevitably be lost. The opportunity for such a confrontation presented itself quite unexpectedly when Mrs. Fairfax appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate that very afternoon, resplendent as always in her yellowed wedding dress, but carrying herself with a subtle tension that suggested considerable anxiety beneath her carefully maintained facade. "Miss Marple?" she called in her refined voice, though Miss Marple's trained ear detected a slight tremor that hadn't been present in their previous encounters. "I wonder if I might have a word with you?" Miss Marple set aside her knitting with deliberate calm, though her pulse had quickened considerably at this unexpected development. In her experience, when dangerous people sought out seemingly harmless elderly ladies for private conversations, the results were rarely pleasant for the elderly ladies in question. "Of course, my dear," she replied with her gentlest smile, gesturing toward the garden bench. "Do come in and sit down. I was just thinking how lovely it would be to have some company." Margaret entered the garden with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances, the wedding dress rustling softly against the autumn foliage as she arranged herself on the bench. Miss Marple observed that despite her outward composure, the woman's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, suggesting considerable internal agitation. "I've been hearing the most disturbing rumours," Margaret began without preamble, her dark eyes fixed intently on Miss Marple's face, "about that gentleman who arrived in the village claiming to know me, Mr. Pemberton." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, though every instinct was alert to the danger of her situation. She was now alone with a woman she believed to be a serial killer, in the privacy of her own garden, with no immediate prospect of assistance should the conversation take an unfortunate turn. "Yes, such a tragedy," Miss Marple replied conversationally, "though I understand you have an excellent alibi for the time of his death. How fortunate that you were at church when it happened." Something flickered across Margaret's face at this comment, a brief tightening around the eyes that suggested Miss Marple's apparently innocent observation had struck closer to home than expected. "Indeed," Margaret replied carefully, "though I must say I find it rather odd that a complete stranger should arrive in St. Mary Mead, claiming to know details about my personal history." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes met Margaret's dark ones with steady directness. "But he wasn't a complete stranger, was he? He was Richard Pemberton, your sister's husband." The effect of this simple statement was immediate and dramatic. Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her face going pale beneath the wedding veil, as she realised that her deception had been thoroughly exposed. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice had lost its confident refinement and taken on the slightly desperate quality of someone whose elaborate lies were crumbling around her. Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap, her manner still gentle, but now carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Margaret. You see, I've spent the last few days researching the real history of that wedding dress you're wearing, and I've learned some quite fascinating things." Margaret's hands moved instinctively to the dress's bodice, a protective gesture that confirmed Miss Marple's assessment of the garment's psychological importance to its wearer. "The dress belonged to your sister Constance," Miss Marple continued in her measured conversational tone. "She wore it when she married Richard Pemberton in June of 1975 at St Anne's Church in Maidbridge. 3 days later, she died in what appeared to be a car accident, though I rather suspect it was something considerably more deliberate." Margaret's face had gone completely white, but her eyes blazed with the sort of trapped fury that Miss Marple had learned to recognise as particularly dangerous. "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Constance had everything. Beauty, love, happiness. She didn't deserve it. She never appreciated what she had, never understood how lucky she was." Miss Marple nodded with apparent sympathy, though she was carefully noting the confession implicit in Margaret's words. "So you decided to take it from her?" "I didn't decide anything," Margaret snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. "It just happened. She was driving home from visiting friends and I followed her. I only meant to talk to her, to make her understand how unfair it all was. But she wouldn't listen, wouldn't stop the car, and when I forced her off the road—" Margaret's voice trailed off, but Miss Marple could fill in the horrifying details easily enough. The accident had been staged, Constance murdered, and Margaret had seized the opportunity to steal not only her sister's identity but her entire life. "And the dress?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Margaret's hands clutched at the yellowed satin with possessive intensity. She was going to be buried in it. Can you imagine? All that beauty, all that perfection, rotting in the ground when I was still alive, still needing what she had taken for granted. So I made a substitution, found another dress that would serve for the burial, and kept this one for myself. Miss Marple observed the twisted logic that had allowed Margaret to justify her crimes to herself. In her mind, she hadn't stolen the dress. She had rescued it from waste, preserved it for someone who would properly appreciate its significance. "And then you began your career of befriending elderly people and inheriting their estates," Miss Marple continued. "How many have there been, Margaret? How many lonely old souls have you convinced that you were their long-lost relative before arranging their convenient deaths?" Margaret's expression grew crafty, the look of someone who had grown skilled at deception over many years of practice. "They were all alone, all forgotten. I gave them companionship in their final months, made them feel loved and valued. If they chose to remember me in their wills, where was the harm in that?" "The harm," Miss Marple said quietly, "was in the murder. Because they didn't die naturally, did they? You killed them, just as you killed your sister, just as you killed Mr. Hartwell when he began asking inconvenient questions about your documentation." Margaret's face hardened into an expression of cold fury. Mr. Hartwell was a fool who couldn't leave well enough alone, and that interfering Richard Pemberton should have stayed away. 20 years wasn't enough. He had to come back and try to destroy everything I'd built. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding as she realised the full scope of Margaret's criminal enterprise. This wasn't merely a case of identity theft or even serial murder for financial gain. It was the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened to expose Margaret's fundamental deception about who she really was. "But now you know too," Margaret continued, rising from the bench with predatory grace. "And I'm afraid that creates rather a problem, doesn't it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple remained seated, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "You can't possibly believe that killing me will solve your problems, Margaret. Too many people know about your connection to the recent deaths. Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, half the village has been discussing the coincidences." Margaret smiled, but it was the sort of smile that belonged more properly on the face of a predator than a grieving bride. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, my dear Miss Marple. You see, I've become quite expert at arranging deaths that appear perfectly natural. Heart attacks are so very convenient. They can happen to anyone at any time, particularly elderly ladies who live alone and might become overly excited by disturbing revelations. Miss Marple understood that she was now in immediate mortal danger, but she also understood that running would be both futile and undignified. Instead, she remained seated and continued the conversation as if discussing the weather rather than her impending murder. "I'm curious about one thing," she said conversationally. "How did you manage to kill Mr. Pemberton while maintaining such a perfect alibi at the church?" Margaret's smile became genuinely pleased, the expression of an artist discussing a particularly successful work. "That was rather clever. You see, the wedding dress isn't the only thing I borrowed from my dear sister's wardrobe." The implications of this statement struck Miss Marple with sudden, horrible clarity. Margaret had used an accomplice, someone who could wear Constance's clothes and impersonate her, while Margaret herself committed murder elsewhere. But before she could pursue this revelation further, Inspector Slack's familiar voice called out with blessed authority, "Mrs. Margaret Fairfax, you're under arrest for the murders of your sister Constance, Mr. Hartwell, and Mr. Pemberton." Chapter 10, Justice in White. There are moments in village life when the ordinary rhythm of existence is punctuated by scenes of such dramatic resolution that they seem to belong more properly in theatrical productions than in the gentle lanes of St. Mary Mead. The arrest of Margaret Fairfax proved to be precisely such a moment, though the true drama lay not in the handcuffs or official pronouncements, but in the final collapse of an elaborate deception that had been 20 years in the making. Inspector Slack, accompanied by 2 constables, and Dr. Haydock, had approached through the garden with a sort of quiet efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than fortuitous timing. Miss Marple, observing the inspector's unusually competent handling of the situation, found herself wondering what had finally convinced him to take the recent death seriously. Margaret Fairfax, still resplendent in her yellowed wedding dress, turned to face her captors with the sort of theatrical dignity that had characterized her entire performance as the grieving bride of St. Mary Mead. But the mask had finally slipped completely, and what remained was a woman consumed by decades of jealousy and murderous ambition. "Inspector Slack," she said with remarkable composure for someone who had just confessed to multiple murders, "I'm afraid there's been some sort of misunderstanding." The inspector, however, appeared to be in no mood for further deceptions. "I don't think so, Mrs. Fairfax. Or should I say, Miss Margaret Fairfax? We've had a very illuminating conversation with your accomplice." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with interest. The accomplice, the person who had enabled Margaret to maintain her perfect alibi while committing murder, had apparently been apprehended and persuaded to cooperate with the authorities. "Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw," Inspector Slack continued, consulting his notebook with unusual attention to detail, "the woman you hired to impersonate you at various social functions while you attended to your more murderous business. She's been most cooperative in explaining your methods." Margaret's face went pale beneath her wedding veil, but she maintained her defiant posture. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Dr. Haydock stepped forward with the sort of professional authority that came from years of dealing with life and death matters. "Mrs. Henshaw has provided us with a detailed account of how you arranged Mr. Pemberton's death, Margaret. She wore your spare wedding dress to the church service while you visited his hotel room. Quite clever, really, until she realized she was participating in murder rather than harmless deception. The spare wedding dress, of course." Miss Marple found herself admiring the twisted ingenuity of Margaret's plan despite her horror at its murderous purpose. By having an accomplice wear an identical dress to maintain her public presence, Margaret had created what appeared to be an unshakable alibi while actually committing murder across town. "Mrs. Henshaw has also provided us with information about your other victims," Inspector Slack continued relentlessly. "Elderly people in 5 different counties, all of whom died conveniently after changing their wills to benefit a previously unknown relative. The pattern is quite clear once one knows what to look for." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely, her carefully maintained facade crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. "They were all alone," she snarled. her refined accent slipping to reveal something coarser underneath. Forgotten, useless old people with no one to care whether they lived or died. I gave their lives meaning in their final months. Miss Marple observed the twisted logic that had allowed Margaret to justify her crimes to herself. In her mind, she wasn't a serial killer, but rather a benevolent figure who provided companionship to the lonely before relieving them of the burden of unwanted longevity. "And your sister Constance?" Dr. Haydock asked quietly. "Did she also need relieving of life's burdens?" Margaret's face contorted with the rage and jealousy that had driven her crimes for 2 decades. Constance had everything I should have had. Beauty, love, happiness. She took them all without appreciating their value. She didn't deserve Richard's devotion when I was the one who truly understood him. The confession poured out in a torrent of bitter resentment, 20 years of carefully suppressed hatred finally finding voice. Margaret described the car accident with chilling clinical detail, explaining how she had forced her sister off the road and then watched her die, feeling only satisfaction at finally taking what she believed was rightfully hers. "The dress was the most important thing," Margaret continued, her hands clutching at the yellowed satin with possessive intensity. "It was proof that I could have what Constance had, that I could be beautiful and loved and worthy of devotion. Every time I put it on, I became the bride she should never have been allowed to be." Miss Marple found herself deeply disturbed by the psychological implications of Margaret's obsession with her sister's wedding dress. It wasn't merely a disguise or even a trophy. It was a magical garment that transformed her in her own mind from the jealous sister into the beloved bride. Inspector Slack gestured to his constables, who moved forward to take Margaret into custody. "Margaret Fairfax, you are under arrest for the murders of Constance Fairfax Pemberton, Mr. Hartwell, Richard Pemberton, and at least 7 elderly victims across 5 counties. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Margaret turned to Miss Marple with an expression of pure venom. "You interfering old woman. You could never understand what it means to watch someone else live the life that should have been yours." Miss Marple met her gaze with calm compassion. "On the contrary, my dear, I understand perfectly, but most of us learn to find contentment in the lives we actually have, rather than destroying others for the lives we imagine we deserve." Margaret was led away still wearing the wedding dress, the train dragging behind her across the garden path like a yellowed reminder of all the lives she'd destroyed in pursuit of an impossible fantasy. The dress that had been meant to symbolize love and new beginnings had become instead a shroud of jealousy and murder. After the official procession departed, Miss Marple found herself alone in her garden with Dr. Haydock, who had lingered to ensure she had suffered no ill effects from her dangerous confrontation with a serial killer. "I must say, Miss Marple," the doctor observed, settling himself on the garden bench with evident relief, "you took quite a risk confronting her alone like that. She could easily have killed you before we arrived." Miss Marple resumed her knitting with hands that were steadier than might have been expected after such an ordeal. "Perhaps, but I rather suspected that Inspector Slack was having me watched. The coincidence of his timely arrival suggested either remarkable luck or careful planning." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "Nothing gets past you, does it?" "Yes, the inspector finally became suspicious when Mrs. Henshaw came forward this morning. Apparently she'd been having nightmares about Mr. Pemberton's death and decided she couldn't live with the guilt any longer." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her long observation of human nature, she had noticed that accomplices to murder rarely possess the same capacity for sustained deception as the principal criminals. Guilt, like truth, had a way of asserting itself over time. "What will become of the dress?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Evidence for now," Dr. Haydock replied, "though I imagine it will eventually be destroyed. Rather fitting, really. It's caused quite enough tragedy for one garment." Miss Marple reflected on the strange journey of Constance's wedding dress, from symbol of love and hope to instrument of deception and murder. In the end, it had told its story truthfully, revealing through its alterations and stains the violent history that its wearer had tried so desperately to conceal. The village of St Mary Mead slowly returned to its normal rhythm over the following weeks, though the case of the woman in the wedding dress became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of jealousy left unchecked and the lengths to which some people would go to possess what belonged to others. Miss Marple, resuming her quiet routine of garden tending and gentle observation, found herself reflecting on the curious human tendency to mistake performance for reality. Margaret had worn Constance's dress for 20 years, but she had never truly become the beloved bride she pretended to be. The dress had been a costume, not a transformation, and in the end it had revealed rather than concealed the darkness of its wearer's true nature. As autumn deepened into winter, and the last roses of the season gave way to the promise of spring's eventual return, Miss Marple continued her patient watch over the village she loved. For in her long experience, human nature remained remarkably consistent, capable of great good and terrible evil, but always, ultimately, knowable to those who took the time to observe it carefully. The mystery of the woman who always wore her wedding dress had been solved, but Miss Marple knew that St Mary Mead would provide many more puzzles in seasons to come. After all, as she had learned through decades of careful observation, every village held its secrets, and every secret, given time and patience, would eventually reveal its truth. Some stories, she reflected, never truly end. They simply pause, waiting for the next chapter to unfold.